Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us more. I know Monday mornings are a bit hectic, back after the weekend, getting back in the swing of things. So anyone who doesn't know me, so my name's Alex Miller. I work for the recruitment company called Panoramic. So I cover everything from development regeneration. So this can be from housing all the way to commercial capital programs in the public sector and across housing development companies. We had the pleasure today of Caroline Harper and Pat Hayes from Be First, just to give you a run through of the company, the key objectives, how they started, etc. So just a bit of housekeeping rules when they're speaking. If anyone don't mind just muting, because any interference might be a bit bit annoying and something like that. And what we'll do, we'll go through the discussion at the end, then we'll ask any questions then that they run through. So yeah, obviously just as nice to introduce yourself. But when you first ask a question, just say your name and where you're from, so people just have an idea of where you're coming from. So yeah, that's it. On the note as well, just put the hand up so as no everyone's just kind of jumping in, just to keep it a bit more free flowing. So yeah, that's enough of me. I'm bored to hear my own voice. So yeah, I'll pass it over to Pat or Caroline, whoever would like to start.
Okay, I mean, I don't know where you want to start, guys, but I'll give you a brief sort of overview of what Be First does and why we were set up. I mean, effectively, Barking Dagenham is one of the poorest places in the country. It's certainly one of the poorest places in London. We are worst on virtually all indices of social deprivation, whether that's economic, social, health, etc., etc. And a borough that has really been left behind by the market over the last 20, 25 years. Gone from being associated with Fords, May and Baker, all sorts of big manufacturing industry, somewhere where effectively 1980s deindustrialization really took its toll. Also somewhere that had been largely actually created by municipal action. So Dagenham is the Becontree estate effectively, which in its day was the largest municipally owned estate anywhere in the world, built by the London County Council in the immediate sort of pre-interwar period. So, somewhere which was very different in many ways from the rest of London, very different from most of the southeast, very industrial place, very working class area, which really did suffer from, really from 1979 onwards, really up to the virtual closure of the Ford plant in around 2000. From that, loss of jobs, loss of employment, a lot of derelict land, and the council really about 4 or 5 years ago took the view, we've got to do something about this. We've got to do something really drastic, and we've got to intervene in the housing market, because the traditional house builder model doesn't work for us. The traditional market-led approach doesn't work in this part of London, and there's been enormous growth all over the rest of the capital, but very little in Barking Dagenham. So really it was about the council seizing the reins and saying, look, we are going to build out a big programme of housing. There's big housing demand, both locally and in the immediate sub-region in East London. And we're going to borrow aggressively to do this. And then thinking, how is the best way to do this, which can combine the best of the council, but also bring in know-how, expertise, and make the best use of the financial rules that pertaining at the time. And they took the view to set up essentially what would be the regeneration department in most other local authorities as an arm's length company. Very different from a sort of earlier generation of housing companies. I was involved in one in Ealing, which we set up, which are very much about holding the stock and building out relatively small scale interventions, really to try and kickstart market rent housing. What we're doing is much larger scale and is much more akin to an old school development corporation, in fact, something like the Milton Keynes Development Corporation in the 1980s, but on a single borough basis, in that we look after planning, transport, land assembly, as well as estate regeneration policy, and also a big development management role in terms of building out the council's programme of about 5,000 units over the next 5 or 10 years. I mean, we've got 1,500 homes on site at the moment. We'll have completed 3,000, so in our first five years of operation. And the other interesting thing about us is that we're not just a development company, not just a development manager for the council's estate regeneration programme. We also have to generate a return to the council. This is where the company structure comes in, because the way we're set up, we're wholly owned by the council, so it's not a privatisation. we have a small board, all drawn from outside the council, which is again one of the reasons for setting ourselves up in this way. So we draw in extra expertise and manage the organisation from outside. But wholly owned by the council, delivering the council's objectives. The council is our shareholder, and a big part of our role is to deliver a financial surplus back to the council to pay for those desperately needed public services in Barking and Dagenham. So that we had a target to deliver, in our first 3 years, to deliver £10 million surplus back to the council, which we achieved. We've now got to deliver a £10 million surplus every year, and part of that is from development activity. Part of it is from fees, which the council pays to us for development management and control, but we are therefore recycling essentially capital from projects back into revenue, which goes back into the council's coffers, saving the council a lot of money because we've created essentially a closed economy. So rather than the council transferring estates and the asset involved to a housing association or house builder, it's kept in-house. We manage the development process. There is no profit lost to development management organisations, which goes outside the organisation. That profit is all retained within the system. But there's an incentive for us to perform because we're managed on that basis and our accounts work on that basis. So it's quite a sophisticated model. It's very different from 6 bricks or whatever in Waltham Forest and brick by brick in Croydon, which are so essentially there's housing companies doing small housing development on sites. Our financial model is very different. The council continue to own all the land and the assets, except in very few instances where we use SPVs. Everything goes back to the council. We're not borrowing off the council. We're not loaning money by the council. Effectively, we are deploying the council and working as their agent. And we have a very strict process of gateways in terms of the way that, as we take schemes through, they go to various gateways with the council, at which point the council agrees to press the button on funding, whether that's pre-planning, post-planning, and then ultimately to appointing a contractor to build them out. So we're doing an awful lot of things. So it's an interesting organisation, which is a combination of part council department, part significant house builder. Actually, our programme would make us one of the certainly biggest medium-sized house builders in London. And so, that's what we're doing now. And, starting to really see the effects about 4 years in terms of the number of cranes on site, what we're doing, how it's catalysing the private sector as well. Some really significant private sector development starting to come into Barking Dagenham, which was never there before. And one of the other things that we do, again, very different from the other councils or housing companies, because we have that land assembly role and also that planning function. We took forward the bringing the film studios to Dagenham on the Old May and Baker pharmaceutical site, which is the biggest film studios probably in the southeast in the last 50 years. We did all the land assembly for that, bought the various sites in, put it together, took it through planning, and then moved it on to a major US studio operator as a commercial deal, for which the council made some money as well on the land transaction. So that's the sort of model that we do. We're also doing commercial development. So we bought a number of sites, and again, this is where we're different from a lot of other local authorities. This is not a vehicle to sell public asset. This is actually to build and create public assets. Actually, Barking and Dagenham has very limited land assets and land reserves. So we are building up a base of assets by purchasing private sector sites, taking them through the planning process, in some cases building them out. Some of them will move on a shorter term basis. We've now brought another film studio in, for example, on a site which we bought with a view to thinking we'd do commercial industrial development on that. Another film studio came along, so we've now leased that to them. And in terms of the sort of human resource side of it, we started out as a straight TUPE transfer from the council, about 45 staff. We've now effectively, probably of those, about 25 still remain. We're an organisation of about 115 people, mainly drawn in from the private sector, which was part of the original sort of plan that we needed to bring that specialist development expertise in, private sector planning expertise in as well. And in future phases of the business, we're probably not going to expand in headcount that much. But one of the things we want to do, for example, is sell more services into the private sector. We're not going to go out trading all over London, but certainly with planning and development management, where people are doing things in or adjacent to the borough to sell that service to them. So we're split into planning services, split. Caroline could talk about this in more detail, into consultancy arm and the development management arm, and we're looking to do development management work for other developers in the borough, house builders or landowners in the long term. So it's an interesting sort of model, creating a public sector organisation says, look, we've got to intervene in the market. We're going to intervene in the housing market in a big scale. We're also going to intervene in the commercial employment market. And ultimately, we're going, as a confident municipality, we're going to be quite entrepreneurial and sell our services because we really care about the place and we want to take the place forward. And it's starting to work. Things I would say is that it works in Barking Dagenham because of our position that we're in. Got significant available undeveloped land. We've got a council that's very committed to having to solve a lot of its social and economic problems itself because no one else is going to do it for it. So therefore are prepared to borrow significantly. House building programme is probably £1 billion worth of public works loan board money. And the political commitment to essentially set a body up like first and say, look, we will just be the shareholder. We don't want anyone on the board. We don't want to exert that sort of board political control. We don't want to make it a council committee. But we're happy to have that mature relationship, which is, in practical terms, very, very close, but in formal terms, slightly separated, and to make that work. So, those are all things I think that work in our favour. We're also producing essentially a blended housing product, which is all for rent. We can do that in Barking Dagenham because we're relatively low value for London, not for the rest of the world. And there is high demand for sub-market rental housing for people who wouldn't qualify for the conventional council tenure. So there are real opportunities as well as problems, and this works in Barking Dagenham context. Whether you could apply it in Reigate and Banstead or Three Badgers District Council, I don't know. I suspect not, and it probably wouldn't work. But it's an interesting model that works very much in our part of East London. So that's probably enough from me.
Would you like me to talk, Alex? Or are there
Please.
questions?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, if there's any questions at this stage, quite nice, isn't it? Bit of back and forth. Does anyone have questions for Pat?
Can I ask a question, please, Alex? Is that all right?
Of course you can. Yeah, if you'd like to introduce yourself, Michelle, just so everyone knows where you're from, etc., that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. Michelle Thomas, I'm interim managing director at Oxford City Housing Limited. Quite a different market to Barking Dagenham, of course, in Oxford. But I just wanted clarification really from Pat on his point about borrowings. I thought he said in the beginning the borrowings were from the private sector, but then mentioned the Public Work Loans Board. Could you clarify, Pat, where the
no, I mean, at the moment, all our funding, we are set up that we could borrow from the private sector if we wanted to, and we have looked at that quite closely. And the only reason we haven't actually is that the loan rate remains so competitive from BWLB. But at the moment, the way our financial operation works is that the council borrow from the BWLB, and then deploy that money through us effectively. We don't borrow directly, the council borrow directly.
So a follow-up question, thank you, Pat.
Yeah.
Is it the case, because my understanding, which is quite limited of the Public Works Loans Board, doesn't that restrict you somewhat, say, for example, with your commercial activities?
No, it doesn't. I mean, I think the thing is that, and quite rightly, I mean, we've had places like, I think, Reigate or somewhere like that, buying shopping centres and things like that. But everything that we're doing is very much focused in borough, and we're not buying it for commercial return. We're buying it for regeneration benefit, essentially. We have bought a shopping centre, but it's a small shopping centre in our borough, which has a council estate built on top of it. So essentially, we bought that to enable the redevelopment of the shopping centre. Actually, at the moment, CITFA doing a sort of case study on us in terms of this is how you should use BWLB borrowing, essentially driving local regeneration. There's nothing that we do with it. Well, we'll just buy that to make a turn on it. Everything that we do is bought because it's got a direct regeneration benefit. Obviously, you can't lose money on it. And if we make some money, great. And we would hope that one would, because one would come to it as with the film studios. We acquired that land at significant risk, effectively got that project together, then sold it on, recouped the cost and a bit more, and got the film studios in there, which is clearly a major economic generator for the rest of the borough. So that's an example of how we're using that PWLB money as a multiplier. The same with the residential development. You know, clearly we're building a pipeline of rental properties. It goes into the council's investment strategy, which over a 25-year period makes a quite significant return from the rents, because everything that we do and our sort of gateway checks is always going to, will the rents pay back the borrowing cost and all the other costs and still be positive effectively. We don't want to make the type of surplus that a private developer would be at 20%, but we need to make a surplus.
Lovely, thank you.
Claire, well, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, yeah, thanks. I'm Claire Astbury. I'm Head of Housing Strategy and Development at Luton Council, and I think Luton has some similarities probably to your area in relation to kind of post-industrial and kind of the kind of situations you might have on the ground. But I had a question about land, but I'm just interested on the borrowing while we're still on the subject of that. Like, you know, a housing company, the council borrows and then on lend, and actually it's good for the council because it makes money on the on lending. Is that what's happening in Barking and Dagenham as well, presumably? Yeah,
the council on each of the, built into all the SVAs, there's a bit of a lending on lending margin for the council. We've also done some deals with third parties on JVs essentially, where it's limited number and they're sort of fortuitous, but where we've had a site that's adjacent to a third party site and the third party hasn't been able to be involved in a joint development because they can't get access to funding at a reasonable price, we've actually lent them the money on a couple of occasions, so that therefore the council gets a financial return as well as the project.
Okay. So on the land, you're saying that you don't necessarily have that much landholding on your acquiring land, and that's a really interesting concept because we don't have a lot of land either, and there's not a lot of land free. But where we've got land, the trouble that we have locally is that it's coming forward for development, but for the wrong kind of thing, and it's quite hard to compete with. So is that something that you're seeing now that you're getting going, or is it? What's the competition like for land where you're doing land acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite intense, and it's interesting because it's changed over time. Effectively, I think 4.5 years ago, whenever we started, our problem then was commercial industrial landowners with unrealistic aspirations about what they could get on their site, and the difficulty of buying it from someone with an unrealistic aspiration. I think what we have now is a more interesting position that the COVID, Brexit, online shopping, all these things have driven actually demand, particularly for logistics, but also for other types of storage and uses, and like film studio space and things like that, creative industry. So there's big demand now for better quality commercial industrial sheds, which is seeing a convergence between commercial land values and residential land values. You know, we've been outbid on sites where we would think, well, we're going to buy this site for residential development. We've been outbid by mainly US funds effectively, or acquiring for logistics operators, DHL and people like that. So there's an interesting dynamic in the market. So the concern in London, as it probably was in Luton, where all this industrial land will go for housing, it's now almost reversing because people are going, well, it's so much easier, I might as well just do a commercial development. And I think therefore the challenge for us is making sure that it's the right sort of commercial development. So we had a little bit of a standoff with Amazon a few months ago in terms of, you know, don't just want this to be a basic shed with 10 people working there, you know, but we're quite happy to help you find a bigger site where you could do something much more interesting, which employs more people and has more value, etc., etc. So I mean, yeah, I think it's a market that's going to evolve, and it's been interesting to see where that goes in the Southeast. But certainly, very much part of our brief is, you know, we've done a couple of commercial industrial schemes now. Is that, you know, we want to do those schemes as much as we do housing. With Caroline talking in more detail about this area of sort of evolving strategic industrial land policy, but we're very clear, you know, we want to be bringing good quality commercial space in. It's not just about housing. Yeah, it couldn't be just about housing in our borough because we need the jobs, and we've got huge areas of brownfield land as well. But I think it's always going to be that trade-off in terms of what do you want. You know, we've had to push a few people back from, there's a lot of drive in the market for the sort of DIY plum-based type centres, Travis Perkins and things like that. You know, do you want good industrial sites all going to that use? Probably not. Are there better things you could do? So can you work with the developer and, you know, the Chancery Gates and people of this world who do that sort of stuff to get them to do something which is slightly, less retail, sort of trade retail focused, and more, larger scale.
Thanks.
Perfect. John, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Found it very interesting. Thank you. It's John Cosgrave from Ipswich. I'm the development director there. I was just curious. In private practice, it's very clear what viability margins companies operate at, but less so in the public sector, I'm finding at the moment. I was just curious as to when you're buying land acquisition, in terms of your estimation on viability margins, how you estimate and what criteria you measure at all.
Yeah, I mean, we have quite strict SVAs on everything that we do, and obviously it's a discussion essentially with the council in terms of the first thing, we don't buy anything that we can't afford to cover the holding costs and the financing costs on. So that's our sort of immediate checkpoint. So that in terms of new site acquisition, we tend not to acquire something that's totally cleared unless it's in a state where you can get surface storage and things like that on to at least pay the holding costs and the financing costs. So that's a first initial checkpoint. We don't buy sites that we can't cover all the initial day-to-day costs on. Then it is very much about that, where the viability threshold isn't as high as it would be for a private sector organisation, but the modelling is done in exactly the same way. I mean, people who that we've got who do all that stuff have all come from the private sector and follow exactly the same procedure in practice, to be honest. It's just that final, how much money do we need to make, because you're factoring in a number of things, so at the moment we don't add a number for regeneration benefit. What we do add is income from rents over time and various things on the various property types. So I think we're probably very conservative actually. There's more that we could put into the valuation in terms of multiplier for the borough, in terms of whether that's in council tax or in other benefits, but we don't do that.
Thank you.
Chris? Let's go next.
Thanks. Really interesting company model, and I was just wondering about the board. You say it's a fully independent board, yet it's managed to maintain its very close working with the council and be very mission led or very council purpose led, which sounds a great hybrid, really. That have there been tensions along the way, concerns by members, or was the approval processes you seem to have and the governance, was that your protection?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has. It certainly was difficult to get up and running, as these things always are, in terms of that. It's the challenge, I think, for a local authority, and I've been on the local authority side doing this in the past, that it's how you get to that arm's length point that everyone's happy. And I suppose initially we had to take the organisation and the staff further away from the council to make that cultural change, which part of this was about, really, taking a poor performing chunk of the council, improving it. We then, I think quite consciously said, right, we need to go back closer to the council now, because we need to, avoid having a confrontational sort of relationship and have a much more, partnered relationship with a subsidiary. And we've done that. I say a lot of my time is spent around managing the interface between the two organisations, and certainly the interface between the council politicians and our organisation, which occasionally means saying, we can't really do that just because it's a political priority, because it's not going to make any money, etc., etc. But that actually works quite well. And I think there were a number of things that, from learning points, that the council to a degree set us up too early, because they'd never set up any sort of clienting function for us. So that essentially we started out without anyone to bounce off on the council side, and that was then built in subsequently, and things have worked much, much better. Now the council has someone who's responsible for commissioning us, and he's a single point of conduit for us with the council, but also to sort out those relationships with all the various bits of the council, whether regulatory or whatever, on the other side, and that works much better. Shareholder panel didn't work particularly well to start off with, because the members on it saw it much more as a scrutiny committee, so they were scrutinising it and asking for more effectively, rather than acting as shareholders, where you actually say, well, how much money are you making for me, the shareholder? But that's now worked through, you know, and I think now the shareholder panel functions well as a shareholder, you know, so there's a learning experience around it. But I do think for people doing this from scratch, you probably do want to make sure probably build the client function first for what you're going to outsource, and be very clear, you know, in terms of letting go on some of the process stuff, because I think the cultural problem for some of the council offices that as so often, you know, the senior people got absolutely, we want these guys to be independent because we want that independence to generate change. The people then, I suppose, at middle level interfacing with it actually thought, oh, they've been outsourced, so we need to control it more, and therefore project more paperwork in because they think there's more risk, etc. It's actually a danger that you defeat your you know, the reason for taking it outside the immediate council structure is defeated because you introduce a layer of complexity to police it because it's not part of the internal council structure. But we've worked through that, and that now, yeah, not the odd glitch here and there, but that does work well. You know, but I think that fundamental decision to not put councillors on the board, for example, and bring all the issues that then brings in terms of, you know, political parity, all this sort of stuff, was very sensible and quite courageous.
Very good. Thank you.
Perfect. John, is that another question, or you've forgot? It's still, I can't lower it. Oh, you're on mute, John. There, oh, perfect.
Can I just a quick chat? Pat, really interesting, and it is very much different business model to 60 Bricks. It's incredibly diverse as well. It must be quite a challenge to sort of look at a film studio at the same time looking at a rental product and get that through the council in terms of the approval process as well. And also, you know, very different ways of returning the money to the council. That must be quite a challenge.
Oh yeah, I mean it's complex. I mean, it's part of the nice thing about it actually is that we do such a range of things. We're much more, say, you know, we're hybrid of part council department, you know, part development corporation, part housing company, and there's lots of things going at the same time. I mean, certainly the thing that makes it interesting for me is having control of the planning function. It would be much harder for us if we, you know, and I wouldn't be that's an interesting job if you didn't have that control over the planning side of things, you know, because I think it's very difficult if you're just you know, reliant, and it's one of the problems I know they had in the early days in Croydon, really, you know, the planners and the housing company aren't on the same place and on the same person. Ultimately, you know, we have to manage a conflict of interest, but you do that anyway in local authorities and ordinary state regen schemes. But it's a much better place to be in, where you're actually having that role in shaping regen policy and the planning side.
And do you do any sort of private sale at all, or is it all sort of rental income and affordable?
At the moment, we have got some private sale modelled in future years of some of the schemes, and we have had it in and taken it out, and it very much depends on market drivers actually, you know, and we've got a lot of shared ownership in at the moment because that works. It wouldn't work in a lot of other higher value boroughs actually quite so well. So we're constantly playing with the mix actually, both in terms of development and the sort of, you know, mix of people, but also in terms of the financial return. You know, at the moment, the London affordable rent works quite well because we're getting quite a lot of grant, you know, so we're maxing out. That's maxing up against some of the other tenure types. Shared ownership's working quite well. You know, we've got some pretty much market rent in the mix as well. And we have, you know, we are modelling some sale, you know, and again that may fluctuate, I think, as the market fluctuates and as our, you know, product matures and as places mature, you know, and the Gascoigne estate, which we're working on at the moment, you know, we're relatively early, you know, we're the first sort of 1,000 odd units of, you know, what will be 10-12,000 units, you know, when that's finished in 10 years time, the market will probably be in a very different place because it'll be a much more attractive place to live. So, you know, we may well go, yeah, let's put some sale units in here and recoup some of the expenditure, and also, you know, enable us to invest more in the public realm, for example.
Is there any more questions before we move on to Caroline? Of course, we can circle back after. It's not a problem. Is that all right for now? Perfect. There we are then. No, thanks for that, Pat. That's really, really insightful. Caroline, would you like to pick up from Pat, to introduce yourself, etc.?
Yeah, of course. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining. So I'm Caroline Harper, the Chief Planning Director at Be First. My background personally is from the private sector, so the likes of JLL and CBRE. And Be First is the first kind of public sector organisation that I've worked for. So picking up on what Pat said in terms of private experience, and very much that kind of straddling of what works well in the public private sectors. Within my team, and I guess somewhat flippantly like to call it a planning super service because of its potential, which I'll come on to. But I have the statutory functions that you would expect. So development management, but also building control, land charges, street naming and numbering, planning policy, highways and transport, and then also a growing planning consultancy team. And the last kind of few years, and again alluding to what Pat's picked up on, we've got a borough that has enormous political ambitions, hugely laudable as well in terms of the social value and aspirations to effectively make things better. And a key part of my role has been I inherited a team that operated very differently, that wasn't really fit for purpose in terms of delivering what was needed. So there's been a huge cultural shift in terms of how do we, make planning a tool as opposed to this kind of, I think it's a planning profession issue perhaps, of planning being something that is a very much a tick in the box exercise, which is not how I think or operate. But also we've got those kind of confines of the do need planning policy to unlock and also to an extent control what is good development, but also kind of empowering the team to recognise that if a good development comes forward, then absolutely we should be embracing that and pushing that forwards, even if it doesn't 100% meet the words on a page in terms of policy. So that's been a big shift, sort of, I guess, planning as your friend, but also planning as your mechanism to say no to bad development, if you like. And with the borough as it is, with again enormous potential because of the great swathes of industrial land, and it's how do we unlock that for good development. One of the things that we've really been focusing on is getting that planning framework in place again to unlock that. So we've pushed forward our local plan. I have to confess it drives me a little bit nuts, the industry of local plan production, but that's a little bit out of our control. But we've done Reg 18, Reg 19 consultation. We'll be going out for another consultation later this summer before submitting to the Planning Inspectorate. And my team's approach has been very much that kind of let's try and make planning policy as nimble and flexible as possible. And then off that, we've been preparing master plans to unlock the industrial land. And again, this is, it's all about setting those kind of high level principles that give developers and investors enough guidance to see what we're trying to achieve, but at the same time leaving flexibility to obviously accommodate how the market is operating and what's realistic. We all know that planning policy by definition is always behind, so it's trying to build policy that recognises that, but also gives enough of a framework that there is that kind of control and that it's ultimately delivering on that political ambition. And making sure that we're delivering sufficiently high quality development as well. And I'm sure there's questions about that, so please do ask me. Looking forward, and again this has been alluded to already, but very much on my agenda is how do we grow the planning consultancy team in terms of the bulk of their work at the moment is for council owned schemes, and there's loads of that, but we've got a real opportunity to. We do a little bit of it already, but really working for third parties within the borough. One of the things I always used to say when I worked at JLL and CBRE is, oh yes, I understand the politics. I actually think that's a nonsense. And I kind of see it now when I'm interviewing people solely from the private sector. I think you definitely get a different opinion being within that environment and recognising how much that influences what needs to happen. And so therefore our planning consultancy has a it effectively can cut out that middleman. They've got the relationship with the development management team, within our wider team. They can pick up the phone. We're back in the office. They can, walk over to the case officer very easily. They've got the relationship with members directly. It's kind of a no-brainer as to why you wouldn't use planning consultancy in terms of pushing things forward. And the other kind of advantage of it is as has been talked about, Barking and Dagenham is a borough that wants to make things better. We want to challenge and change the, frankly shocking socioeconomic indicators, and therefore it's development that delivers social value and good, and our planning consultancy team is fully aware of that. So yes, you might get planning consultants elsewhere who are like, well, we'll just dismiss that, but actually that is very much on members' radars, and therefore if you work with it, you're going to have a much smoother ride in terms of getting planning permission and ultimately contribute to something that is delivering a high quality development for the borough. So I'm going to leave it there because I just wanted to sort of give you a bit of a summary and then leave it to you for questions in terms of how we operate. So please do fire away.
Perfect. No, that's, I quite like as you said, we come from the private sector straight across. I think people, well, I don't know the thing, but I know Simon and Vic would probably vouch for that as well, joining the council development vehicles. It is a different beast. You can't just go knock down, go on call to get something done. There's politics, headstands you have to do to get stuff going. So no, I quite like that. And also that cultural shift, setting the stall to start with. I think that's quite cool. So you know what you're getting in for. So I quite like that approach.
Definitely. I mean, there is a different type of bureaucracy in the private sector. So it's swings and roundabouts.
Perfect. Is there any questions for Caroline?
I think it's interesting, Caroline. I think there has to be a lot of goodwill within the council to work from sort of cross this cross junction with the sort of private and public sector. I think we're very fortunate at Waltham Forest where there's a real expectation and want to deliver new housing, regeneration as well. So there is a real combined effort that's going forward, and there is a huge amount of both officer engagement and ward member engagement, and also 60 Bricks board. So Pat, I can imagine you've probably got a huge amount going on there as well. But it's a really good place to be, and it's a very interesting environment to be working quite closely with the officers at the same time as being a separate entity. I suppose it's a unique position.
One of the things that we've been we work much more closely with members, like establishing members briefings, making sure that we're tied in with senior officers and all the rest of it, because yes, Be First is an arm's length urban regeneration vehicle, but it's useless if we're not on the same page as the council. It's a bit cheesy, but we're kind of one family, if you like, and we're all working to that ultimate delivery. So there's no good kind of butting heads, because nothing will get delivered.
Vic, you got a question?
Yeah. I was really interested in your, you're talking about the planning consultancy and so on. Do you get pushback from members and public about potential for like conflict of interest, or the closeness of that operation with these planning operation, which is traditionally very much arm's length from the development operations within a council?
Yeah, it's interesting because I get asked quite a lot about conflicts of interest, and I have to confess I don't see it as a conflict of interest. The planning consultancy team operates separately to development management. There are governance structures in place. I see it much more as, actually, because we're in the same company, there's an understanding in terms of planning consultancy as to really what makes the council tick, what do members want to ultimately deliver, and therefore they can advise accordingly and bring things forward. I have been asked about it from third-party developers, but once I explain the governance and everything that goes around it, then those kind of fears, if you like, are allayed. And I do think actually that in some respects it's a little bit of a curious concern in the respect that in the private sector there are quite often conflicts of interest that are not very transparent, but because we are the public sector, we are transparent, we have to be. And therefore, actually, you know, I think there's much greater sort of reassurance in terms of governance. And I just know from, you know, from previous experience, I'm like, well, yeah, but if you actually dug into it, into what happens in the private sector, it's a bit, it's not always quite right. So yeah, that's what we are.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect. Is there any more for any more? Amazing. Okay. Well, yeah, if that's if there's no more further questions, like I'm sure obviously when you go off the call, you're like, oh, should have asked this, etc. So obviously feel free.
You can always send us an email or text us or phone us up.
Yeah, I can pass on, so it's not a problem. There'll also be recording, so I can whiz that across, and then I'll send a list through of everyone who's attended. So, you know, if there's any particular question, let us know. But no, obviously, special thanks, Pat and Caroline. Really insightful. Thanks for your time. I do know business, and thanks for everyone joining. I'll be looking to hold these sort of events every 2 to 3 months. So what I'll do, I'll just keep you on the kind of the email thread. So yeah, feel free if you would like to come along again, even speak. Yeah, it'd be great to have you. But yeah, no, thanks for your time, and hope you have a lovely day.
Okay, cheers, Alex. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. Thank you. It's great.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you very much. Very useful. Thank you.
Cheers.